Hey there, thank you very much for joining me again. I am going to be talking today about how my template in Cubase is set up, and this is really in regards to a few main principles. So if you are interested in getting more reliability and more consistency out of your workflow, and you work with Cubase, then I think this will be of great value to you. If you work in another DAW, I think there'll also be a lot of principles here that you could really do in just about any other professional DAW. But consistency and reliability are big important factors for achieving an ultimate goal, which is staying in that creative flow, always being able to just focus on my music instead of trying to troubleshoot technical issues. Now, I certainly have to troubleshoot technical issues. The thing is that I dedicate time to doing that. I get into that headspace, I troubleshoot, and then I update my template. And then when I'm composing, I just, to the degree that it's possible, I completely ignore technical issues entirely and I just create. So I'm going to go through how my template is set up. Somebody had asked a couple of weeks ago specifically about how the VE Pro instances were set up. So I'm going to talk about that, but I'm also going to talk about my busing, and that may seem like a sort of boring topic, but it saves me a huge amount of time and allows me to make a lot of creative decisions on the fly. Now, if you're a media composer and you're actually trying to do this professionally, you're going to have to write music relatively quickly, and you often have to create alt mixes, different variations of your arrangement, and my busing structure really supports that very well. Another aspect, which I'll get to at the end, and I'm actually going to discuss at the end of this week in much more depth, is how I structure my busing so that I can actually kind of mix a master without having to rely on a lot of processing on my master bus. Now, if that all sounds kind of heady, what it really just comes down to is when I kick out my piano, it's going to basically run at the right level relative to my whole arrangement. And if I spit out my whole arrangement with all the instruments, it's also going to run at the right level. And that's because I don't have a lot of mix bus processing that would handle a piano differently than the whole mix. That's the short and sweet of it. So let's take a look at my template here and get right into it. So a couple of things that I want to point out is that I heavily use this window here. This is the channel settings in Cubase. It comes from this little E right down here. And the reason that I have started using this is just for the sake of consistency. You can modify this variation of what's in your channel strip a little bit, but I don't really do that a whole lot. Oops, sorry, let me take myself off the screen again. And I realize actually I'm in the program view, so let me put that back on. So I use this channel strip window primarily because I want to have the consistent workflow of working with these same plugins kind of in this order. And the compressor's good, EQ is very nice. I actually have engaged a MIDI controller on my desk so that I can just always go ahead and engage these and tweak whatever I want in terms of the EQ, which is what I go for the most. Sometimes I will go in here and add a compressor. We'll see examples of that. Another nice thing about this is I can also see my workflow. So this little button here, Show Output Chain, it shows these mixer faders on the right here. So I can see that, let's go with a track like the Tam Tam, okay? So the Tam Tam here, it technically has my loopback intro or input. I don't actually need an input for this track, but I can see that it's going directly to the main mix. So that over here, when I play it, I'll see the audio and that automation on the fader for my Tam Tam track, but I'll also see subsequent buses. This one's just going to the mix bus, but if there were subsequent buses, I would also see them here. So it really helps me manage my gain staging. I really like this window quite a lot. So that's where I start off with. And it's important to go ahead and right click on this and always say always on top. That way it won't get hidden when you're switching between windows. Another thing that I like to engage is this follow the E buttons or selection changes. This of course is Cubase specific, but that means that if I go ahead and I grab this piano, now I get this window updates to the piano. And if I go into my, in this example, I'm using a lot of pitched percussion, if I go in here to my vibraphone, then you can actually see here the output structure, the vibraphone fader, but that's going into a mallet stem, and that's going into a high-mid bus that is just for instruments in that range, and then that goes into the main mix. So I can see my entire kind of gain structure there, which I really like. Now another thing that I'm going to point out, because I rely on a lot, is this sync project and mix console and sync track and channel type filters. Because what that does is in Cubase it means that I can go ahead and look at all my stems, and right now I'm looking at them in my project view, but if I look at them in the mixer view, I'm going to see the same thing. So whatever the channels are in my mixer are also the channels that I see in my project view, and that's really nice work. Saves me a lot of, again, keeping me in that creative flow, right? So how does this structure save time? One of the main things that I do to save time is I use these things called configurations up here in this drop-down box. So my audio sort of structure, my gain staging and audio flow follows through a few steps. It starts with instruments. These are basically all coming from VE Pro. Instruments go into stems, things like, you know, high, low, brass. Those get funneled into registers, which is basically just 4 registers. I have low, low, mid, and high. And I am going to get into that at the end of the video just briefly, but I'm going to talk about it a lot more in live stream at the end of this week on Friday. Then I have audio and MIDI. These will actually just show me only audio tracks or only MIDI tracks. And that's really helpful for me to just quickly, again, save time, right? So I can get to what I want. I love this search feature. If I wanted to find my marimba, then I just hit that, and there it is. It's highlighted my marimba. I love that. So those are some things that save a lot of time. Well, I've talked a little bit about using this window here, and this creates a lot of consistency in my workflow. If you're not using it and you're using individual plugins, ask yourself, you know, are you really using plugins that aren't available in this channel strip? Because I think it really helped me a lot in my workflow when I started using the channel strip. And generally, I'm just applying EQ and compression to the vast majority of things. Of course, I can go and add anything I want anytime I want. It's just that having the consistency of this interface is really helpful. So let's talk a little bit about these configurations, because I think they're really key. Basically, I've set up configurations here to kind of set me up for different stages of my production. So this is easier to see in the mixer view. So I'll go into the mix console here, and if I go into instruments, well, I can basically, all I ever do in instruments is I use this pre-gain to gain up the levels. So if I play my music back and I think, oh my gosh, you know, this track over here, this harp is way too quiet, then I can just gain that up here. I don't know if we actually want to do that. But the idea there is to have a mixer window and a configuration that is kind of for a phase of my work. Now, all of these instrument tracks here are coming directly from VE Pro. Let's look a little bit at how I have VE Pro set up. Over here, under this Rack Instruments folder, these folders and channels are created automatically when I create an instance of VE Pro. So if we were to come over here to this instance of VE Pro here, my woodwinds main, okay, that is this right here. I've got piccolo, the flute, you know, 3 flutes, 2 oboes, clarinets, bassoons. And over here for that instrument, you'll see that I have all of those outputs enabled. So basically in VE Pro, I've told VE Pro to send this many outputs to any instance, whether it's in Darko or Cubase or Logic or wherever. And if I enable all these inputs, anything with a checkbox next to it automatically gets created by Cubase over here. And this is really nice. Although it has an instrument track icon, and it does function in a lot of ways like an instrument track, it's not exactly an instrument track because I can't write MIDI onto it, for example. But what I can do is I can set up effects and processing on there if I want, or EQ. So if I know, for example, that the piccolo on this particular library is, just always a little bright, then I can actually just put a permanent EQ in there. And I know every time I load up this project, every time I load up from this template, which is pretty much my standard template, I know that my piccolo has already been tweaked. And if I need to, if I encounter some similar problem with a new instrument, having the template gives me a way to go ahead and sort of identify the solution to that problem, maybe a little notch in the EQ, save it as part of the template, and it's done. So I really like the fact that these tracks are all created automatically, and that I don't need to waste my time remixing every single thing. I find that every time I use this template, I make tweaks, and my mixes get better and better and better with less and less time investment. So yes. Hey there, Rich. Thanks. Hopefully the screen's looking better. And yes, thank you. I'm sorry if I have a hard time with your name, but Panayotis, thank you very much for joining me today. If you guys have questions, of course, please post them and I will definitely address them. So reliability comes from, I think, consistent workflow. Setting up your template so that it solves the problems that you have. Now, the problems that I generally want to overcome is that I want to write music, not be dealing with technical stuff. So my template has all the VE Pro instances already set up. I have a collection of macros, which I'm not going to cover a lot today, but I think if you've watched my channel, you've seen that I use a lot of macros. Again, I just press buttons on my devices here in my studio, and it does things for me. That sort of reliability and consistency keeps me in the creative flow. Having the consistency of the same interface, whether it's my buttons or whether it's using configurations here in Cubase, or just having a certain set of tracks that are always present, that sort of consistency is conducive to the creative workflow as well. Just like if an artist goes into a studio and the paintbrushes and the jars are always in different places, it breaks up their computer flow, their creative flow. If everything's in the same place, they know where to look for it every time they do a project, they reinforce that and they get faster and faster. That's been my experience. So definitely recommend spending some time building out a template with this consistency. Now let's look a little bit at how these things are bussed out, because this is very, very important. I talked a little bit about these configurations earlier, and these represent my bus stages. I start with instruments. This is all VE Pro stuff coming directly out of VE Pro. That's these channels here under my rack instruments. They're created automatically, and they're just part of my template. But they all bus into a stem. So let's look at how that appears in my mix console. When I'm looking at instruments, basically up here at the top, they're all routed into a stem. So I have a stem called low brass. I have a stem called drums, low, metals, that sort of thing. And these are all my instruments. I can quickly see if they are playing back just by looking at the meters up top. And I can see where they are bused to. These busing options here, the routing options, stay the same pretty much all the time. These are my stems, so a much smaller group of channels, right? So this is just a small number of channels. And the idea here is to hone my decision making. So on the first level of my audio with instruments, really the only thing I'm looking for is gain. Is there enough level on these tracks? And is it routed correctly? And that's why they're the only options here. Okay, once I get to stems, however, I'm thinking more about processing. Now you might notice that every one of these stems has a relay on it. Relay is part of a software package by Isotope called Neutron. And I do confess that I use Neutron, which basically mixes stuff for me, creates a rough mix. I invariably make changes to that mix, and I'm really only using it to set levels so that I just basically always have these relays open. Neutron is really fantastic in my opinion. There's this mix assistant icon here, or button here on the visual mixer if you have Neutron 4, and then you basically play through the song and it sets levels for you. All of these faders down here stay down, but the individual relays have the faders set to a value that the software concludes. So that basically generates a, it's not really processing exactly, it's just kind of like a fader gain. It's basically mixing levels for me. Saves me a lot of time and I get good results from it, so I'm happy about that. I generally don't want to do any effects processing on this view on the stems level, but I do in some cases. Like here I've got this piano or this keys stem, which I put a delay on because I liked the way that it sounded. So, you know, that's easy enough. Let me just, I'm not sure why that, oh, it is automated, that's why. It is bypassed. So I don't generally run effects on here, okay? But I have the option of doing that like I am in this instance here. Where I really do the mixing is just with the levels, and I do that with Neutron over here. This is my mix, my sort of master bus here. I've got the Neutron visual mixer. Really doesn't do anything other than mix for me. Set levels with all the relays. It doesn't do any other effects processing. I have Insight here, which I use to see the arc of the level. I'll actually talk about my mix bus processing in just a minute because I don't want to talk about too many things too quickly. I really want to stay with this idea of the gain staging. So instruments, I just am setting the levels. Stems, I might add some processing, but basically I just use it for mixing and making sure that you know, I have a sense of what's happening, which stems are actually being used. Then all the stems, they go out through direct routing, which is a Cubase Pro only feature. These go out, generally they go out to either a low, low mid, or high. In some cases they just go directly to the main mix. But those are what I call my register buses, and I just have 4 of them down here, right? So I've got 4, let's get the names up there. I got low, low mid, and high. Here, this is where I do the vast majority of my processing. So I do have reverb on here. You can see that I have EQ going on my 4 register buses. I'm going to take these 2 instruments off there. Cubase has a weird thing where if you add an instrument, it sort of adds them to all your configurations. So I just take those off and then I update my configuration like so. And that's what I want to see. But this is presenting me with EQ, and it's presenting me with my reverb sends, because this is where I'm going to do my real effects processing. And the idea here is that I'm certainly adding reverb, but I also am trying to sculpt my final master in a way without using a lot of master bus processing. Now, I'm going to talk a lot more about this in my live stream that I'm going to do on Friday, but I'll give you sort of an overview of why I might want to mix on these register buses, which as far as I've seen is not a terribly common approach, but it works really well for me. Here are my reasons. Generally, a good mix for media composers and film scoring is going to have certain properties in the low end, the low mids, the high mids, and the highs. So those 4 regions of the frequency spectrum, you want to have well-controlled but supportive bass. You want to have well-controlled and present low and high mids. And then you want your highs to be probably fairly airy. And when you're listening to a reference track, for example, you're listening to something that you know that this is a professional score, this is a professional piece of advertising music, and you're trying to get your mix to fit that. I find 9 times out of 10 the biggest challenge for me is getting the relationship of the bass, low mids, high mids, and highs all working together so that they are consistent with the industry standard. So this allows me to go ahead, add EQ, and you can see that I'm adding some very dramatic EQ here. In some cases, very dramatic EQ. And what am I targeting, right? Well, I'm targeting over here. Let's take a look at this wonderful beauty right here. This is really one of my favorite plugins. It saves me so much time and really is a nice creative environment. Rich, I see your comment about Neutron 4 and not having used that feature. If you are not using tonal balance control and you have that as well, you may have that as part of Neutron, and I highly recommend checking it out. This is what it does. Basically, when I play back my music, it's going to create this white line that sort of represents what my whole mix is doing on a frequency spectrum basis. And this blue line here is representing a sort of model, I suppose, a reference that I'm trying to track. And that reference is up here. I just have something chosen. It's called modern, right? And what I'm basically going to do is I'm going to tweak my EQ, and I'm going to tweak my compression and my levels on my individual tracks. Sometimes I use a limiter like this. So I've got this brick wall limiter here, and it's set to jam up my levels so that I basically get this white line to sort of more or less follow inside this blue curve. So the tonal balance is kind of like my visual guide. Of course, I'm also using my ears, but I live in a neighborhood where there's a lot of sounds, a lot of noise, a lot of distractions. It's not uncommon that I'm in less than a perfect listening environment, and listening on headphones has its own problems. The combination of using my ears and using this kind of meter really, really helps. And the best way to mix to this meter is if I can run my tweaks on these 4 frequency ranges. There's another view of this plugin which actually breaks it up into these 4 regions, right? So you got your lows, your low mids, your high mids, and your highs. And in this instance, you'll get this little white line that kind of shows up there. And I'll actually mix to that. And generally, I find that that gets me 95% of the way there, and I make a few tweaks. So having the structure of all my VE Pro instances or instruments, they're set up in the template automatically. They get run to stems. The stems all get run to these register buses, or in some cases the main mix, and all the register buses go to the main mix. Also, I really do all my effects processing on the register buses. I don't do them on the individual instruments, which saves me a lot of time, and I think also produces more reliable mixes. So I think that's it for right now. The one last thing that I will point out is, actually I'll point out 2 things. One is these sort of admin tracks that are part of my template pretty much all the time. Signature, tempo, if you're familiar with Cubase, you kind of know what these are. Sometimes like these 2 marker tracks, I use these for film scoring when I am trying to hit individual hits in a video project. But I always have these. I have my time code ruler in addition to the bars and beats up at the top. So those are sort of my admin tracks. These are present all the time, chord tracks, so on and so forth. The last thing I'll point out is how I do alt mixes. So a lot of times when I create a piece of music like this, which is a production music cue, they'll want a version that, you know, I don't know, maybe has no percussion or is just drums and bass, something like that. And I need a quick way to produce an alt mix. And the way that I'll do that is using a feature that is also only part of Cubase Pro, and that is called, let me go to stems here. It's called direct routing right here. And if you don't have it on your mixer, then you can enable it up here, right there. You have to put a little checkbox next to direct routing. And what direct routing allows you to do is allows you to output that channel, post fader and post effects, everything, just like the main output for that group bus or instrument or whatever. It allows you to send it in multiple places at the same time. So it's like you have 2 outputs or 3 outputs or 4 outputs. I think there's a limit on it, maybe 8 or so that you can add to the direct routing. But it's really nice because I can actually just select, my drums here, and I can say, oh, I don't want those on, so I'm going to hold down Option and Shift, and now they're off. They're not going to be sent to my main mix. I also use that in conjunction with snapshots over here, which actually saves the mixer, including my direct routing, so that I can wind up using mixer snapshots to create a snapshot that represents, my main mix, alt mix 1, my drum and bass mix, etc., etc. All right, I think I've covered quite a lot today. If you have questions, please do post them in the comments. I forget off the top of my head what it was that I was covering this Wednesday, but I did post my schedule on the community tab on my channel's homepage, so go check that out. And if you have suggestions for topics that I might cover, please let me know as well. Thank you so much for joining me today, and if you're watching this after the fact, please like and subscribe if you're new to the channel. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time. Bye.